at 4.5 or 5 feet's fine. A little drastic, but let's go back on our second. I would have taken out 3 feet max, and then next year take out some more. I doubt that you did any harm, but that's what I would have done. And in doing so, then, if I had time. And stories from my youth, if my mother was gone, my dad would prune, and he would be in a hurry before she'd pull back in. So you may have been in the same situation. Otherwise, prune to a bud that is on the outside of a stem so that when subsequent growth takes place in the spring, it will hopefully and mostly be those top buds that open out and go away from the middle, or growth out and then up, so that they don't get too tall and narrow, too compacted inside, and so on. Rosa Sharon is not particularly fussy about that, but its nature is to be a little bit vase-shaped, starting at kind of a center of roots, stem crowns, whatever you want to call it, and then going up and out. And you'd want to keep that in mind to keep them somewhat natural looking. But still, Bob, I don't think you made any mistakes. Timing was right. You could follow up with some removal of older stems, clear through just prior to growth in the spring. Anytime now that you have time and put on your heavy jacket and gloves, you can go out and do some more pruning. But I think you were golden. Would have been okay if you'd called first, but you did no harm.
There you go. And, one of the questions that people have all the time with not only Rose of Sharon but with every plant is, what can I do either now or in the spring to promote more flowers?
Yep.
I mean, let's face it. You want that because it's got those gorgeous flowers on them. What do you do to promote more growth of the actual flowers?
Well, Mark, that is a very valid question, and it's kind of hard to answer in less than 5 hours. Because
let's not go there.
Yeah, no, we don't dare.
Okay.
Each plant has, I'm going to call it its preference. Each plant, as we have talked about on the Rose of Sharon, some spireas, butterfly bush, and so on, flower on the new growth. Roses, are also in that same category. They flower on the new stems of each spring's growth.
Okay.
So you can prune roses this fall later. I don't like to force them into dormancy or try to and then have them be growing internally tissue-wise too late. But anyhow, roses are normally pruned hard in the spring. Or as hard as you wish. And the same with these other few plants. Now, if it's a magnolia, a lilac, a forsythia, whatever, those plants have already set their flower buds for next year. So one of the ways then, Mark, to cater to flower is to be sure which kind of plant you're dealing with. Lilacs, for example, can be pruned. You will not hurt the plant, but you will be indeed removing flower buds from that plant ready for next spring or next early summer's growth and beauty.
Right.
So that selection of when to prune is one of the things. The next thing is this business of cutting to outside buds is not a terribly significant thing. However, you can work with the natural shape of the plant if you do that, and then by virtue of air and sunshine moving through that plant earlier in the day, etc., whatever it may be, there is less incidence of disease. For example, wet springs like we've just had 2 years in a row, one of my arborist friends said in a dry spring I'm a saint, and in a wet spring I'm a sinner, just by virtue of trying to defeat the fungal diseases and so on plants. Well, same thing. If you can get the plant to air out earlier in the morning, more sunshine in through the day, it will develop a little better. It will have less chance of contracting some of the many fungal diseases and so on. So that's kind of step 2. The next thing then is watch for fertilization. Now, this is the 5-hour part. Plants do a tremendous amount of things internally. It's something we never pay any attention to, and until you're a physiologist or cell anatomy person and you're working with electron microscopes, you never see these things. But plants are guided by their own hormones and lots of external factors from weather, both underground and above. When you trim a plant, I would still go back to the 25% reduction at any one time. Now, you can do that 2 years in a row and, so to speak, take the plant on down farther. As Bob did, no harm on a Rose of Sharon, but that comes nearly half of the height of the plant. A little bit on the drastic side, but they're so resilient, probably no trouble. But other plants, I would be a little cautious about doing it that way. So that, let's just say, is where you want to remove 25%. You are indeed taking off newer tissue as well as some old stems from the bottom. You're causing this plant to restart in the spring on less leaf-bearing structure. So, without going overboard, and this is where I recommend strong caution, I am not opposed to fertilizing plants that I have pruned, but I do it on what I will call the light side. Now, you're going to have to go back to package instructions and et cetera to get into the finest of details. But if, for example, a bag or box of fertilizer tells you to use a cup per whatever, I would be inclined, just because I want to keep that plant's health up, but not necessarily make it grow fast again, I would be inclined to cut that to as much as half of the amount of fertilizer. Now, there's all kinds of things that are pro and con on this, but that's just where I kind of try to guide things.
You know, we were talking about what's in color a little bit ago, and I had one or two little flowers on my roses, and then they just exploded this week. I have probably 10 or 12 on each rose bush that I have.
This is the famed last bloom, Mark.
Yeah.
And it's always glorious. I don't know as it exceeds the number of flowers in the spring, but plants have gone through the summer, the hot, dry, all the things, and then for the last month to 6 weeks, conditions have been a little bit better. Not so dry, not too wet, not terribly dry, etc. And they have set buds, and right now it's bouquet time again. I don't have quite the same relationship in numbers that you have, but I've gone yet the next step. On 3 plants in particular, where they are, I don't trim them down as far. They stand middle to background in the flower beds and so on. And I leave the last bloom that they had of significance, I leave that alone. I don't prune. I want the rose hips that are now pretty well fulled out. They're not quite as orange-red as they can get, but I like that aspect of the fall so that when you allow them to develop fruit, and again, this is not scientific, but by and large, they will chemically introduce themselves to the fruiting process, develop the fruit heads, well, let's just say the beautiful part that's coming on, and then kind of turn away from setting new flower buds. So you can handle them that way. Yours and some of mine, I don't have very many anymore, but they can go on. Some I leave for the hips, and happy both ways.
Once again, if you have an email question, you can send it to Fred during the week, fred@planttalkradio.com. And we have Mark's question coming up next that he sent in this week, and more this morning on Plant Talk. Stick with us.
This summer at Franklin Park Conservatory and Botanical Gardens, the gardens are in full color. Welcome its tropical and native butterflies in flight in the indoor Pacific Island Water Garden. View the conservatory's bonsai collection and experience the exhibition Origami in the Garden. Find details at spconservatory.org.
And welcome back to the program. Mark News here alongside Fred Howard, the Ohio nurseryman. And Fred, our buddy Art called up and said that you had mentioned about, we were talking about pruning all of these perennial plants.
Yes.
Something about the butterfly bush and how far down you should cut that.
Okay. He may not have heard the whole comment. I normally take butterfly bush down to 5, 6, 8 inches tall. And there have been occasions where after a harsh winter, I've had to cut them clear to the ground, and it's almost June before there's any regrowth because they are on the tender side. I do this because I like the plant to start from low, grow up fat and bushy, and yet if I didn't prune that hard and there was still live tissue, it would start to grow pretty much from whatever I left, let's just say 2.5 feet, and on up from there, which may then show up its what I call leggy bottom later in the summer. So I prune down to around anywhere from, zip, depending on the spring season or winter, and up to about 6 inches, so that they have to start out from very near the ground, be fat and bushy. So, Art, that's what I would recommend. And at the same time, if your butterfly bush is mid to background in a flower bed, then you can cut just down to where there has been a kill from winter weather and so on, you might be leaving 2 and even 3 feet. One of my friends has done that because he put them in that position. But it's a choice. And just simply get the job done before growth starts in the spring. So we're talking jacket-type weather in March, very, very early April.
Mark sent us an email, and he says that a few weeks ago he emailed us about moving his agapanthus and lantana indoors for the winter. He said he went ahead and did that last Saturday, and so far so good. But he says he had a couple of follow-up questions about specifically about the need that the plants have for light in the wintertime. And he says he's in a tiny apartment, and he doesn't get a ton of natural light through the windows, at least not direct light. So he's wondering, does he have to supplement that with some artificial light? And are there any signs he should be looking for to indicate that the plants need some more light?
Well, now, again, hard to answer, but let's give it a shot, Mark. Both of those plants taken into your apartment and only in direct light, which will be very low in intensity and so on, cues me to where you better be planning on just maintaining the plants indoors over winter so they don't freeze and die, etc. I would not try to grow them. And by that, then, simply, as the intensity of light has been dropped down necessarily, I would back off on water, too. Now, not zero by any means, but I would go down to what I call substance of growth, where you want to keep them moist enough the roots don't dry up. You don't want to keep them in a pot that will stand too wet because the use of water, therefore, in limited light is less, and you could start some decay in the root system and so on. So, dry them down, if you will, and by that meaning not to zero, but where on a philodendron that can grow under very limited light or pothos or whatever, you can grow those guys indoors. I have one that's now probably 10 years on the same plant stand, well within the enclosure of the living room, gets only, well, it gets some light during the day, but it gets only sunshine into the room in the later afternoon after the oak tree has defoliated. And that plant can be grown on during the wintertime. It slows down. I, therefore, slow down a little bit on the water. That is one level.
Okay, now, I'm going to stop you for just a second. Okay. I know you're on a roll, but when you say cut back on the watering, enough to keep them alive, but not enough to get them to grow. How do you do that? What do you like? Is there a frequency, or do you look for? Do you put? I put my knuckles on the soil and feel to see if there's any moisture. I mean, what do you look for there?
Let's start right there, because knuckles on the soil, when you learn to read your knuckles, can be very, very helpful. And on those pothos and philodendron plants I mentioned that can grow under very reduced light, you'd want to feel some dryness in the soil, but only just dryness. Now, you might want to go with your fingertips down to the first knuckle, because when it's dry down that first half inch, we'll call it, then you should be watering again. Now, in the plants like the agapanthus, etc., he's going to be waiting until that plant is dry down maybe 2 knuckles deep.
Okay.
This is a little difficult to explain. I would rather he would put these plants, for safety to furniture and floors and carpets, I'd rather he put them in a saucer of some kind. Doesn't matter what, just so it holds water. I'd like him to put some gravel in the bottom of that saucer, depending on its height, etc. I would use something that's 1.5 inches high, lip on it, and then theoretically put in 1 inch of gravel. I would then be inclined to water to the point of running down into that graveled area with the excess water, but watering very infrequently. Now, that could be down to where the philodendron, you might be watering every 2 weeks, the agapanthus, etc., it might be every 3rd week.
Lantana, same thing?
I'm sorry, yes. Lantana, by all means, the same. Now, lantana can probably grow a little bit better in limited light, but it won't flower well. It'll get a little straggly and so on. So it's the knuckles, it's the gravel that contingers water, and then that water evaporates and keeps some moisture on the leaves and so on. So it's It's hard to explain, but each plant has its own needs.
And we're going to talk a little bit more about indoor light coming up next on Plant Talk. Stick with us.
This summer,